This week, I am sharing a Christmas-themed watercolor greeting card design, which is going to be awesome whether you're just getting started with watercolor and are looking to practice essential techniques, maybe master your water and brush control a little bit more, or you're a little bit more advanced and you're looking for ideas for artwork to maybe work on and give away this holiday season. In this one, I am taking you through my entire process, starting with how I create my preliminary pencil sketch, stemming from basic shapes. And then I move on to swatching out my colors for you and explaining how I'm gonna be painting each element. And then I'm gonna be moving on to explaining all of my favorite techniques, how I combine wet on wet and wet on dry for depth and dimension, how I create an interesting bleeding effect outside of these Christmas ornaments, and I even share some of my favorite tips for adding handwritten lettering into greeting card designs that you create with watercolor or other drawing or painting mediums. All right, with all that said, let's jump in. The first thing that we need to do is we need to create our preliminary pencil sketch. So I'm gonna show you an easy way to draw these ornaments. And this is just to first visualize those ornament shapes as simple geometric shapes. In this case, these shapes can be ovals and circles. I don't want these to be perfectly aligned. I want the circular one to be somewhere over here. I'm going to be using an HB pencil. I want to make sure that I'm keeping my outline sketch nice and light so that I'm not able to see my pencil work through my paint at the end. So the first ornament is just going to be a basic sphere that is going to be around there, and I don't want my ornaments to be perfectly aligned. I want them to be kind of in a triangular positioning. So the other one, the long one, is going to start somewhere around here. The bottom tip is going to end maybe somewhere around here. So you can see how I'm helping myself with simple shapes, tick marks and lines, that kind of thing. But I'm continuing to keep everything very nice and light. I'm gonna create a bit of an oval or ellipse here. Doesn't have to be perfect. First, it's essential to visualize how big it's going to be in itself and also in relation with other elements that are going to be involved in the composition, and also to make sure that you understand where it is going to be, its location within space. The other ornament that's also an oval, but it's kind of more horizontal and this is more vertical, is going to be slightly behind this one. So it's going to end somewhere around here. And I want it to be peeping out from behind this one a bit over here. This one is more centered in space, I guess you could say. And then this one is kind of, as I said, a horizontal oval, kind of like that. I do have a video in which I explain why drawing curves and circles and ovals, ellipses, that kind of thing is so tricky and challenging, and exercises that you can do to improve your circles and ellipses that are very effective. I'll make sure to link to that tutorial down below in the text section of this post so that you can go and check it out if you haven't already. As you can see, I have basic shapes for my ornaments, sizes and locations are looking good, and now I can go ahead and actually turn these shapes into Christmas ornaments. So how do I do that? I can go ahead and start adding in this little top attachment thing into all of these, and then this one can be here, and then these two are going to be pointy at the bottom. This one here and this one here, and I want to make sure that I visualize that little point in the very center of that shape. When you have symmetrical objects like this, sometimes it's helpful to visualize a vertical line running right down the middle of that shape or form, or a horizontal line depending on what it is that you're drawing. But this way you can keep things as symmetrical as possible. I don't want to draw any extra lines or erase too much on my watercolor sheet, but depending on the complexity of what I'm drawing, I might create my preliminary sketch on a separate sketchbook and then trace over my sketch and transfer my sketch from my sketchbook onto my watercolor sheet using tracing paper. So now that I have those, all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add in the little design into my Christmas ornaments. And for this one, I want kind of a, not stripes, but like curves running vertically down this ornament. Maybe divide this shape into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections so that I can play with color. I can use my kneaded eraser to do a little bit of cleanup work. Sometimes I also use my kneaded eraser to do some gentle tapping over areas if I feel I've darkened them too much. So that's the design for this ornament. The bottom one is just going to have a horizontal stripe going across. I'm gonna clean this up a bit. You can do any refinements that you might need to do to make your shapes more symmetrical, but make sure that you keep things pretty clean and light so that your graphite work doesn't overtake or overpower the watercolor, and so that you don't muddy up your vibrant color with too much graphite. All I am missing is the little string. I'm gonna do a little extra curve here, an extra curve here, a string, and extra curve and string. And there we go. We have our 3 Christmas ornaments. I also like adding the lettering in pencil first before going in with either watercolor or pen and ink or whatever the case may be. I'm gonna create a very light vertical line right there, right where I'm thinking of adding in the letters. I'm gonna be adding Happy Holidays to the bottom of this card. You can definitely add whatever message you'd like. Happy Holidays has a total of 14 spaces if you count the blank space in between the 2 words. So what I like doing is taking that total number of spaces that I need for each letter that I'm going to be bringing in, or the empty space between my letters, and then dividing that total number into 2 is going to tell me how many letters or empty spaces should fit in the left half and how many should fit in the right half. This just helps me ensure that all of my letters are going to fit in my working space and that my phrase or words that I'm going to be adding into this greeting card are relatively centered. Obviously, the more professional I want my handwritten lettering to be, the more time I spend on this. Sometimes I also bring in a ruler just to make sure that the letters are aligned. So if it's your final piece that you're creating, feel free to spend more time with this. I know that I should have approximately 7 letters and or spaces here and 7 letters and or spaces over here. This masking tape is keeping some of that paper protected for us, so we can count on having a little bit of a border added to this, so I could just create that H right up next to the masking tape if I want to. And your letters don't have to be perfectly drawn at this point. The objective with me drawing the letters right now is simply to have something to visualize there before going in with more permanent mediums that I'm not going to be able to erase. If I don't do this and I just go in with pen and ink and do my letters, or with watercolor or whatever it is that I'm going to be using to paint or draw those letters, I often end up with my words not being aligned or with some of my letters not even fitting in my space, and I don't want that. So by going in and first adding my letters in pencil and visualizing their location and space and their size, I'm able to avoid that kind of accident later. Happy, little space, holidays. There we go. I'm going to be bringing in 5 different colors. My first color is going to be Pyrrole Scarlet, which is a warm red. This is what Pyrrole Scarlet looks like on its own. The second color I'm going to be bringing in is New Gamboge, which is a warm yellow. And New Gamboge looks like this. The next color that I'm going to be bringing in is this deep, dark, rich green. This is called Russian green. It's from St. Petersburg White Knights. I really love this green. It's warmer and very rich and dark. Looks like that. And I'm also going to be bringing in some Payne's Gray to darken other colors. Payne's Gray is a cool gray that has blue in it, and it looks like this. And finally, I'm also going to be bringing in some raw umber. I usually prefer burnt umber, but I ran out, so I'm just going to be using what I have. Raw umber looks like this. And it's going to help me create that golden color for that little attachment at the top where the string is. That's all I'm going to be using for this one. I'm going to go ahead and change my water because we're going to be using some pre-wetting techniques and we need clean water for that. I'm going to be using only 2 brushes for this, and these are both round brushes. This is a size 14 round and this is a size 3 round. I'm just going to be switching between them as I go depending on the size of the area that I am painting in. I'm going to start with my size 14 round brush, pre-wetting those bristles, taking just a bit of water from my container. And I'm going to start with the simplest ornament here just so that I can explain this technique that we're going to be using in all these. But this one is much simpler because it's just a simple sphere with one single color all throughout. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do pre-wetting using clean water throughout the entire circle. Okay, so what you want is a nice even sheen all throughout the circle. Go over that area as many times as you need to until you see that even sheen and nothing is starting to dry on you too fast. And once you have that circle pre-wetted, you're going to go ahead and pre-wet outside of the sphere. So I'm taking a little bit more water, and for this ornament, I'm going to be pre-wetting to the right so that I can have this beautiful bleeding effect where the yellow is going to be bleeding out toward the center of the piece. And when you're pre-wetting past or outside the ornament, I want you to pre-wet way past the area that you want your paint to reach or expand. Because if you just pre-wet a small section, when you drop in your paint, that paint is going to reach the edge of your pre-wetted shape, and you're going to be left with a sharp defined edge. And that's not what we're looking to create. What we're looking for is a soft gradient where the color transitions into the whiteness of the paper outside of the ornament. So you need to make sure to pre-wet a good amount of paper so that that paint has space to expand and create a nice soft transition or gradient where the paint dissipates into the whiteness of the paper. See that nice even sheen there? I've pre-wetted quite a bit outside of that sphere. Take your time with the pre-wetting process because if you just go over everything once, things are going to start drying on you too quickly and you're not going to be left with those soft effects. So this is going to be the yellow ornament. I'm going to take a good amount of this new gamboge and I'm going to get started with my first layer in the yellow ornament. Dropping in my yellow into the sphere and a little bit past the sphere into this wetness that I've created over here. I'm gonna remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles, and if the paint started expanding too much, too close to that edge of that wet section that you created, just push it in or pull it in and soften that transition, that edge. But I'm gonna do a little bit of sculpting in the sphere here. You can see how I kept a little bit of the center there free of paint. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take a little bit more of my new gamboge and add it into my color mixture, saturate it a little bit more, and place it along the edges to darken the edges of the sphere. And I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit of my raw umber into my new gamboge. And with this darker version of my new gamboge that has the raw umber in it, I'm gonna go ahead and just add it into the edges again. And this is just the first layer. We're gonna be doing a little bit more sculpting and defining with a second layer, but I already want to create a little bit of a range of values to start conveying some depth and 3D-ness in that sphere. I remove that color from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water, and I'm just gonna help transitions a little bit more manually by going in with my paintbrush. I want to encourage you to not move the paint around too much. I'm gonna add a little more new gamboge into my mixture to work on midtones a little bit more, and I'm just gonna drop it in here. Almost done. Things are still wet and workable because I took my time with that pre-wetting process. So I think I've developed a nice range of values for my first layer. If you need to switch to your smaller brush to clean up some edges here, you can go ahead and do that. And if you need to work on your transitions a little bit more or push in a little bit of that paint so that you can have a soft gradual transition outside of your ornament, you can also do that. You can do whatever you need to do, whether it's adding more paint or do a little bit of lifting to reveal some of that paper under that paint to create more dimension if you think things are looking a little bit too flat. You can do whatever it is that you need to do as long as the paint is still wet, because if you continue working when your paper has already started to dry, you're going to arrive at that overworked, splotchy look. I would highly recommend allowing the yellow paint to dry completely before moving on to painting the next ornament with the next color. You can definitely speed up that drying process by using a hairdryer. This one down here has a stripe, and I want that stripe to be red. And I can't paint green over something that I want to be red because the green is going to affect the red. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tackle the top section and the bottom section separately, but the technique is the same as what I did over here. Starting with the bottom section here, I'm gonna go ahead and pre-wet all the way down here. Go over everything a few times. And I have my green ready on my palette. This green is pretty dark already, so I'm not really gonna have to add in another color to darken it, especially not with this first layer. With the yellow, it's different because yellow is very, very light. So I did have to add in a little bit of another color into it to darken it since that first layer. But the green is already so dark that I don't need to do that. So I'm just gonna start dropping in my color here. Remove that color from my paintbrush bristles, and I'm going to do a little bit of sculpting here. And I want the paint that is coming out and bleeding out of this ornament to be very irregular. I don't want to have the same amount of paint bleeding out over here on the left as I do in the right. I'm just going in with a clean brush and doing a little bit of sculpting and manually pushing or pulling that paint in whatever direction I need to push it or pull it toward so that I can arrive at an organic, soft, irregular effect here at the bottom. Taking a little bit more color, and I'm gonna drop it into the edges of this ornament here and start doing a little bit of sculpting the same way that I did with the sphere at the top. Hopefully you can still see your pencil work through that first layer. But the idea is the same here. I want to arrive at a range of values, meaning lighter green areas, darker green areas, to help me convey the three-dimensional structure, which is round. And when you're working on things from imagination, like I am today, trying to keep that central section of the sphere or whatever rounded object it is that you're drawing or painting, it's gonna help you create that three-dimensional look. Add a little bit more green outside here. Everything is still wet and workable because I took my time with that pre-wetting process. Adding and subtracting paint, but at the same time trying to allow that paint to do its own thing and not doing too much scrubbing or lifting, because I know that that is going to lead to an overworked result. Adding a little bit more paint down here. You can see how the paint up here reached the edge of the pre-wetted shape. So I'm just going to push this down and push it down over here as well. I don't want a straight defined edge around my bleeding effect here outside of my ornament. I'm gonna leave it at that. I'm going to change to my smaller size 3 round brush, and I'm just gonna clean up my edges here with a clean brush. Don't go in with a lot of water in your brush when you have wet paint on your paper, because you can create backgrounds very easily. So we're done with the bottom section. I'm gonna go ahead and tackle the top. I'm gonna paint that little section there separately from this section over here. I'm gonna pre-wet all of this upper part of the ornament, not that little stripe that I want red later, not that little stripe in the middle that I want to paint red. I'm gonna pre-wet a little bit past the green over the yellow even, but not that metallic little section at the top where the string is. I don't want to paint over that because that's going to be a very light golden color. If your water starts turning murky, make sure to change it, because if you do pre-wetting with dirty water, you're going to see that color on your paper when you're pre-wetting if your water is not clean. Alright, so same thing here. I'm gonna go in with my green, pretty watered down initially. I'm gonna place my green here, right along the edge of the red stripe, or the stripe that will be red. A little bit past the ornament. You can see how much I'm helping myself with my absorbent towel. Just gonna get rid of some of this texture here and soften it a little bit manually, taking a little bit more green paint and sculpting here. Trying to lift up a little bit of that paint from that central section. Cleaning up some edges. I'm gonna go ahead and change my water now because it's quite dark and murky. So I had a little bit of splotchiness right here because I didn't allow the yellow to dry completely before starting to do my pre-wetting for the green ornament. So what I did was, after changing my water, I went in to do very gentle scrubbing with a clean and slightly damp brush. Tried to lift up a little bit of that visible edge of the splotch that I had in that area. And after having done that, I just added a little bit more water into this area and dropped in a little bit more yellow. And now you can't even see that splotch anymore. It's always going to be safer to allow that previous color that you were working with to dry completely before going in and painting the next ornament. This upper section of my sphere is completely dry. So what I decide to do here is I'm gonna go in and do pre-wetting along this edge, a little bit into this upper left section, avoiding painting in the little metallic attachment here at the top. And I'm just gonna pre-wet a little bit up here in this corner of my piece, and I'm gonna drop in a little bit more yellow. This is plain New Gamboge. That's enough paint. Remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles, and I'm gonna go ahead and manually soften transitions. That's enough color there for the yellow one. What I'm gonna do now, while all of that work dries, is I'm gonna paint the red stripe in the green ornament. This section here is pretty dry, and this section here is pretty dry. For this, I'm going to switch on over to my size 3 round brush because this is a pretty narrow shape. And I'm gonna take some of this paint from the edge of my puddle. I'm gonna start painting in this red stripe. You can see how my red is pretty watered down, pretty light in this initial layer. That's what I want. I'm gonna paint this section here. I'm gonna take a little bit more of my Pyrrole Scarlet and drop it into the edges to create a little bit of a range of red values in this stripe. Do any lifting that you might need to do. Left a little highlight section there unpainted. In just a bit, we'll be painting in this little teeny tiny green section. And I'm going to allow that to dry. All right, I'm gonna quickly go ahead and paint this little green section right there with my small brush. And I'm just gonna leave this section with no bleeding outside of the ornament. Okay. There we go. I'm gonna allow everything to dry before going in and painting the red ornament. All right, so everything is pretty dry. I'm gonna go ahead and start painting the red ornament. I'm using my size 14 round brush, and I'm just gonna be pre-wetting the entire ornament shape except for the top attachment there. And I'm gonna be pre-wetting a little section to the left outside of the ornament and a little section to the right of the ornament. So that's the ornament pre-wetted. Now I'm gonna do a little tiny bit of red over here. I'm avoiding pre-wetting the upper attachment here, and a larger section over here along the right edge. So I'm taking a little bit more Pyrrole Scarlet. I'm gonna be dropping it in along the edges. I'm getting some bleeding happening where I've already pre-wetted outside of the ornament. You can see the bleeding over here to the right. I'm gonna remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water drippage, and I'm gonna soften the bleeding effect outside of the ornament. Maybe push a little bit of this pigment out to the left. I'm gonna leave a little bit of a white highlight section there in the middle. Removing that paint from my paintbrush bristles and softening edges again. If I see any sharp edges, like for example down here, I'm gonna soften that edge. I don't want sharp edges outside of the ornament. And now I'm gonna take a little bit more of my Pyrrole Scarlet and I'm gonna drop it in to strengthen the red in some sections, especially along the edges of the ornament. Removing that paint from my paintbrush bristles, and I'm going in and doing some sculpting manually while trying to preserve some lighter sections in the central area of my ornament, bringing in that whiteness of the paper to help me develop some lighter value areas. Maybe I can place a little bit of red paint right here outside of the ornament, manually softening that transition between the yellow and the red, cleaning up this little part there. Bringing in a tiny bit more pigment into the central section. The highlight is just a little bit too large. And with that, I'm all done with the first layer of red in the red ornament. We're now going to go ahead and paint the little top attachments, starting with the yellow one, which is completely dry. I want a kind of gold color for that top little section there. So I'm gonna mix together my warm yellow with my raw umber, and this creates a nice golden color, which we can use for those top little bits. First, I'm going in with just a tiny bit of paint, pretty watered down color. And here it kind of gets lost with the color of the ornament because we use those same colors in this one. We'll be defining things a little bit more with the second layer. I need to allow the red to dry because if I paint the golden little section over here up top, it's going to start bleeding into the red because the red is still wet, and this gold section right here is also right up next to the red, which is still wet. All right, so the red is relatively dry, so I'm going to go ahead and use my smaller brush to paint in the little top attachments in the red ornament and in the green one. All right, great. And if you need to soften or clean up any edges where maybe that paint reached the edge of the shape that you pre-wetted, you can go ahead and do that before jumping into the next part of the process. Just soften the color here at the bottom just a bit. I make sure that everything is completely dry before doing any scrubbing and lifting. And I always make sure to be very gentle with my scrubbing whenever I'm going to be using that technique because I don't want to start damaging my paper. I'm pretty happy with my gradients outside of the ornaments. So at this point, we can go ahead and start working on the second layer inside of the ornaments, which is really going to make those ornaments pop. So going back to my new gamboge plus raw umber mixture that I was using in the first ornament, very heavy on the yellow and very little brown. I always want to make my way toward a darker color incrementally. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a second layer to push darker value areas and just define certain edges for this ornament a little bit more. And you can see how the shapes that I'm painting in with my size 14 round brush are very abstract. I'm not creating perfect lines and least of all outlines around my sphere. I'm not creating blocky, heavy shapes, and I can even leave little sections of the edge of that sphere with the previous layer left alone and not covered with the second layer. I kept everything very abstract, very irregular, as you can see. I removed that paint from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess strippage, and if there's any inner edge of that shape that I want to soften, I just go ahead and do that with a clean and slightly damp brush. By doing this, by creating those darker value shapes around the sphere, I'm able to enhance that sense of 3D-ness because I'm expanding that range of values and I'm creating darker tones. Right here, I'm just cleaning up the edge a little bit. You can feel free to use your smaller brush for this if you want. And if you want to push contrast, you can add a little bit more brown into the yellow and place it here and there into certain sections as long as that first lighter layer is still wet so that you can have those nice soft transitions. All right, so that is it for that ornament. I'm gonna work on the green one now. And for the green one, I'm just gonna continue using my green from St. Petersburg by itself because as you can see, it's a very dark green. I don't need to add any other color into this green. If you can't see your pencil work through your paint, especially when it comes to your green, which is a darker color, go ahead and sketch in your shape again. Just make sure that everything is dry so that you don't damage your paper with the tip of your sharp pencil. So I'm creating those abstract shadow shapes along the edges of my ornament with my green. And right now I'm using the green in more of a milk consistency, whereas before I was using more of a tea consistency or coffee consistency, and I was just using more water. I use less water as I move forward in the painting process. Okay, I'm gonna remove this paint from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess strippage, and I'm just going over some of these edges to soften them and create a natural gradient or transition along the edge of my ornament there. Once I have softened that, if I want to take more paint and push certain edges a little bit more, I can do that. All right, so I'm going to soften this before it dries. Soften the edge. And soften this edge as well. How quickly or how slowly your paint starts to dry is really going to depend on not only the paper that you're working on, how textured it is, if it's 100% cotton, etc., but also the environment that you're working in. If you're working in a warm environment, a cool environment, dry, humid, all those things are going to have an impact on both your painting process and, of course, the end results. And it's good to just be mindful that these things change day by day. Just soften this edge because the paint expanded again and reached that edge. Soften this here, and I just kind of sculpt the ornament. I'm gonna leave that bottom edge soft there. I'm not gonna add any more paint into that area because if I add dark green all throughout the edges, that can look a little bit too outliney, if you will. I'm done with the green. I'm going to allow that to dry before painting in the second layer in the red stripe, because if I paint that in right now, I can get bleeding happening between my green and my red. So I'm gonna go ahead and get to work on this one here. Adding more Pyrrole Scarlet into the puddle there. And when it comes to the red, I will be creating another version of my red that has Payne's Gray in it. Just a tiny bit is enough to darken that red. For this particular ornament, I'm going to be darkening that central section, and then I'm going to be leaving this one here to the left and this one to the right with just the first layer shining through uncovered. And then I'm going to be darkening the stripe over here on this edge and the stripe over here on this edge. I'm going to take some of my plain Pyrrole Scarlet and I'm going to paint in this middle part of the design. You can leave little sections of paper unpainted if you want to create little highlights throughout that shape. Making this highlight shape a little bit smaller. So that's that first layer painted in. I'm going to take a little bit of my Pyrrole Scarlet that has the Payne's Gray in it, and I'm going to drop it in while that first layer that I just painted in is still wet, further pushing the red values here and there in this front central section of the ornament. For these more narrow left and right sections along the edges, I'm gonna use my size 3 round brush because they're smaller. So first I'm going to once again go in with my plain Pyrrole Scarlet. And I'm gonna try to run my paintbrush bristles over everything, this entire shape, a couple of times. To keep things wet and workable for a little bit longer. Now I'm going to take a little bit of my second red color mixture that has the Payne's Gray in it, and I'm going to drop it in some areas to create a little bit of a range of values throughout that shape. All done. I'm going to allow that to dry. Remove that color from my paintbrush bristles, and I'm going back to the plain Pyrrole Scarlet. Create a little bit more symmetry here, taking advantage that this middle shape is still wet. Continuing with this one here. Got a little bleeding effect right there because the green is still wet. That's okay. Sometimes bleeds can look pretty nice. So going back to my dark red color mixture that has the Payne's gray in it, and dropping it in here and there to get a little bit of a range of red values in this darker red section. All of the red shapes that I just painted in are still wet. So if I want to go in and do any cleaning up of edges that are maybe a little bit jagged or irregular looking, I can go ahead and do that. If I want to go in and do any lifting with my clean and slightly damp brush and use my brush as a little absorbent sponge, I can also do that. Just dropping in some more dark red. All right, cool. You can see how I got that bleeding down here because the green was still wet. So I'm going to change to my slightly larger brush. This is a clean brush. And I'm just going to push the red and absorb some of it. Maybe not all of it. I kind of like the bleeding there. But I don't want any stark texture that can really distract the viewer. I'm going to keep that bleeding effect nice and subtle. I'm going to take a quick sec to paint that little curve and the string in all of these. I could go in and just use the Payne's gray, but I feel that that's going to be a little bit too stark looking. So I'm going to use some of my brown. So this is raw umber, and I'm going to use my small size 3 round. And you want to make sure that there is enough water in your mixture so that you can go in and create one single stroke, especially for the string. If you go over it multiple times, it can end up looking like a hairy line. So make sure that there is enough water in your color mixture. Just the tip of the paintbrush. Taking a little bit more paint with the tip of my paintbrush and painting in this last string. Getting a little bit of bleeding there, so I can use a clean brush to just do a little bit of lifting here. Going in with my absorbent towel, just blotting. Okay, I'm gonna leave that to dry and I'll go in and fix anything later. Sometimes when painting with watercolor, it's best to allow things to dry before attempting to fix anything. We need to be patient. Some darker tones along the edges of these metallic little sections on top of the ornaments. So I'm going back to my yellow plus brown color mixture, and it's not super dark. I'm still going in with a coffee consistency, pretty watered down, and I'm just gonna go in and darken certain sections so that this can pop a little bit more. Just darkening along the left edge and the upper edge there. Wet on dry, and then going in and softening. Same thing for this one down here. Darkening along the left edge and along the top edge. Removing that paint from my paintbrush bristles and going in and softening. Again, this one over here, left edge, upper edge. Removing paint from my paintbrush bristles and going in and softening. The majority of this red is dry. I'm gonna go in and do some very gentle scrubbing and lifting here where the paint kind of bled a little bit too much. Lifting up some color. I'm gonna leave that to dry and then I'll come back and fix this edge of the red shape here at the top. For now, I'm gonna go ahead and create the darker red values in the red stripe here and the green ornament. So just like what I did with the darker red sections here, I'm gonna go in first with my plain Pyrrole Scarlet and paint some of this in as a kind of bridge transition color between my lighter red and my darker red. I'm gonna go in, remove the paint from my paintbrush bristles, just quickly soften some edges. Then I go in with some of my darker red that has the Payne's gray in it. I need a little bit more of this color. That's a little bit too dark. I'm gonna add more red into my color mixture. I'm gonna soften this here. And create some dark red sections to provide a little bit more of a sense of dimension into this ornament. Okay, I'm gonna leave that section completely white as a highlight. I'm gonna allow this little section to dry because I just went in with some gentle scrubbing and lifting, so the paper is still damp. So if I try to go in and paint that section, I'm gonna get bleeding again. I'm gonna leave this to dry and then I'll come back in and darken this area right there. All right, so I'm gonna quickly fix this little mistake here where I had that bleeding. I'm just gonna go in with my plain Pyrrole Scarlet first. Darken a little section where I'm looking for defined edges. Remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles and go in with just a little bit of water in my paintbrush to soften edges because I'm painting wet on dry, and to keep that little section that I just painted in wet for a little bit longer. Then I'm gonna go in to drop in some of my darker red that has the Payne's gray in it, just here and there. And there you go. That's the way that I would fix that mistake. And it just goes to show how important it is to just leave things be and allow them to dry. When you make a little mistake like that, things are fixable, but we need to stay patient and allow things to dry when working with watercolor, and then we can go in and fix that mistake. I'm going to go in and just darken some little edges here for this other red section. Softening with a clean and slightly damp brush, very gently, very minimally. If there are any edges that you want to define wet on dry, you can go in with a third layer. But just keep your darkest shadow shapes very abstract. You don't want to go in and start creating outlines around your shapes. It is now time to start adding my handwritten lettering in the bottom of this greeting card design. So I'm going to be using this 0.5 tip Uni Pen Fine Liner from Mitsubishi Pencil Co. And this is a great pen to use with watercolor because its ink is water and fade proof. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating bubble letters around these regular all caps letters that I have created for myself in pencil. I'm doing my best to keep the thickness or the width of my letters consistent. Just as much as possible, but sometimes small imperfections can add to the personality of the piece. You can see how I'm continuing to use my pencil work loosely to visualize the letter that I'm gonna be adding, to have a little bit of a guide for myself. And finally, there's the S. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye, guys.